Uh, okay, we are now recording the audio, and in theory, we should be having people join us shortly in the YouTube live. We've got the promotions out there, and the email has gone, and we're on the front of the home page, which is great. I'm going to count down
Oh, we didn't do. Yeah,
now.
sorry. Did you? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. No, go for your life.
cool. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm co-host of the Hoon with fellow co-host Peter Bale in Hoon Bay. How's it going, Peter?
It's going very well, Bernard. I guess because it's Te Reo week, we should say that we're going to do some Korero Kai Pākehī this week, right?
Ah,
But without
yeah.
Giles, I was going to say Giles Brandreth, Giles Bickford. The Korero Kai Pākehī is going to be with you and me talking about money subjects.
Yes,
Correct.
that's
It is Te Reo
true.
week, isn't it?
It is, absolutely.
Yeah,
And
I think you do a
it
brilliant
must
job of
have,
it. And I was really sorry. I was really struck by the person. It was a pretty awful story, one of those awful, slightly contrived Radio New Zealand stories sometimes about this kind of subject, about the Martinborough Bakery, which was giving away a rum and chocolate bonbon thing, or some sort of sweet, to people who tried to order
ah,
their pastries in Te Reo, which I thought was a brilliant idea. I mean,
what
there
a
won't be
great
any of that
idea.
when David Seymour's in charge. There won't be any of that nonsense. But I thought it was a lovely
Boy,
thing.
he went over the edge a bit this week. There's been a couple of strange and dodgy things said. For example, he almost revelled in the idea that a National Act would sack 15,000 people
15,000 civil servants. Yeah,
before
there'll be
Christmas.
fairly uncivil
That's
servants by the time that comes about.
that's true. You want us to give you a briefing, Minister?
Fuck you. Yeah, exactly. Sorry,
Yeah,
did I just say that out loud? I did. Yeah,
exactly.
sorry. Um,
They would love to say it out loud, but probably couldn't.
shall we
So
shall we
yeah,
do a little bit of a run through about what we're going to do today? Because we've got Sir Robert Patman, or Professor Robert Patman, soon to about Ukraine, Elon Musk, and one of our lovely subscribers, David Coombs from Hoon Bay, who's also in Hoon Bay, I believe, um, wrote to me saying, could we have a bit of an update on, he thinks we do things on demand, a bit of an update on the Ukraine war. So
oh
I've
yeah,
had a bit of an advanced chat with Robert because we sometimes turn him into a sort of armchair general when, of course, he's got a gigantic scope of, brain on legs from Otago.
but
But
there's
we're going to
been
do a
a
lot on
lot.
New Zealand politics too, Bernard, right?
Yeah, yeah, and there's been a lot happen in the last 3 to 4 that we haven't really touched on, and plenty of action this week. Things flying all over the place, and and also plenty of action too in the whole geopolitics around the world to
Oh,
do with
yes.
it. Yes, and we've got an election campaign here this week. Plenty of
Oh,
drama
tell me about it.
around about fiscal holes and debates around whether foreign buyers will buy as many houses as National thinks they will. I managed
And
to
if they do, there's your housing market gone completely
oh
up the
yes,
wazoo,
and
and we'll be even richer than we already are now because we were of our houses.
when we
Not to
say
get you
we,
started on your
yes,
favourite subject.
yeah. Well, anyone who's about to be buying or owning a house for $1.6 million will now know it's suddenly worth 2 million. Eh,
Exactly. That's what I'm certainly hoping. And Bernard, I was really struck talking to our lovely friend Patrick Smelly from Business Desk this week that people were sneering at him, apparently, possibly even members of his own staff, for having described Christopher Luxon as being a Napoleonic plutocrat. Uh, which I rather like because somebody there's an English website that I really like a lot called thecritic.co.uk from the Critic magazine, and they do a very very good weekly parliamentary sketch with an incredibly obviously faked picture. And when I saw the picture that was illustrating Patrick's piece where he described Luxon as being Napoleonic in a mocking fashion, Christopher Luxon was wearing a kind of some weird cross between Napoleon and Captain Cook's outfit, with a tricorn hat and carrying a sword with which he appeared to be doffing somebody on the head. And I just thought that's got to be a fake picture. That's got to be just cut and pasted because it was too ridiculous for words.
no,
And
no, it
I'm
wasn't.
afraid, yeah. So he hasn't. Lesson number one: do not put on silly hats or silly uniforms. Do not Boris Johnson was the great silly hat man, of course, as well. Silly hat and silly hat. He would, if there was a fluorescent vest that could be found, he would have it.
Yes, and he would come down a flying fox on it and then get stuck halfway up, looking like the little boy whose breeches have been pulled up.
A rather fat little boy, yes, a rather fat little Tom Brown school days.
Yeah. No, the only thing missing from Christopher Luxon's tricorn hat sword outfit this week was the satin sash across the front.
Yeah. I am very keen to watch the new Joaquin Phoenix film about Napoleon, where the pictures of Joaquin Phoenix looking. I mean, almost don't even need to see the film. It's as though Joaquin Phoenix has just kind of embodied. The whole of Napoleon.
The facial features.
I think it's one of the Ridley brothers who's made it. I mean, it looks absolutely sensational. Although I have been told it's a bit. I have seen ideas that it's a bit woke, in which case I should love it.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's also a fantastic picture doing the rounds of Elon Musk dressed as Napoleon, which we'll get to when we're going to do a little Musk segue. We hope, Catherine, when we get to Professor Patman. Or Sir Robert, as I have decided to start calling him.
Robert, yes. No, our segue form is hot.
Speaking of knighthoods, Bernard, I nearly
almost had the perfect segue. Anyway,
I know. I nearly fell out of my chair this week, and when I saw that an old friend of mine, Will Lewis, the former managing editor of the news editor of the Financial Times, and eventually chief executive of Dow Jones, and who also mopped up Rupert's problem with the News of the World hacking people's phones. Lo and behold, because he was advising Boris, is now Sir Will Lewis in the UK. So I thought that was,
at least
I'm
he's done
fractionally
some
older
work.
than him. I'm fractionally older than him, so I'm kind of irritated. Now, segue, back to your segue.
So we're hot with the segue action, and the planet is hot at the moment. Catherine, it's lovely to see you again. Lots of great work this week, keeping on top of the climate action. And I wanted to start off with the election campaign and the non-climate policy from the major parties that have come out this week. And in particular, Labor came out with a trial, they call it a deep housing refit program, also exactly, and also has not moved to stop new gas connections. Could you talk us through what's the problematic about all that?
Yeah, I found it quite frustrating. I mean, we have some lousy housing stock in New Zealand that's cold and damp and energy inefficient, and so there's all sorts of good reasons to have policy that improves that. But this particular policy that came out before the weekend, they were talking about deep retrofits, so first of all, they were talking about deep retrofits of houses where you could get double glazing and, extra insulation and all sorts of things, and they would cover 30% of the cost up to $80,000. So that's an almost $60,000 refit. Who's getting these things?
Wait a second. That is exactly what it would cost to do at least to do some drafty old villa. And what's also going to happen is because I can see this happening in the UK where they're trying to get everybody to move to heat pumps, is there's going to be some fantastic heat pump cowboys. In fact, that should be Bernard and my new album, the Heat Pump Cowboys.
Well, it was definitely, another policy for the so-called squashed middle and nothing. What was it? Squeezed middle and nothing for the squashed bottom. Yeah, squashed bottom just gets to pay for it.
Yes.
And then there was the bit about
that's too silly.
Nothing for the squash bottom, and then there was the bit about the gas refits, and that's where they will pay you to electrify your gas connection. But I've sat and watched in the last few years, something like 3 of my neighbours have retrofitted their electric connections for their hot water and gas stoves to gas. So they've got big gas bottles on the side of the house. So that's just happened. I was sitting there watching it going,
but
I thought we were in a transition.
No, but that's an interesting idea, because what they're doing is they're converting it to propane, I assume, which is or possibly not LPG. That's a very, because of course National and Act are going to repeal the ban on offshore energy exploration. So we're going to have a 5 or 10 or probably no New
We have
Zealand
lots of gas to.
30-year transition with lots of gas, which
Well,
makes some sense.
But this is kind of the problem, is that where everybody is allowed to do these retrofits to put in gas instead of electricity, and then the taxpayer gets to pay for them to put it back again a few years later.
That's right.
That's like running water into the bathtub with the plug out. Like
you mean like
really
Watercare
back
with
to
what
front.
35? Or sorry, it's like Wellington actually, isn't it? Actually, some days you get shit coming out of the tap, and then the next days you get nothing coming out of the tap, and you wish you had still had the shit coming out of the tap.
Well, the infrastructure is a whole other subject of things not being invested in.
So, Catherine, where does this go? Is this another one where they're just never going to have to implement it, though? So they're just flicking things out.
But I mean, to me, it was just looked like another lolly scramble for this so-called squeezed middle to try and get a few extra votes. But actually, it's just another thing that the squash bottom gets to pay for and gets no benefit from.
Exactly. Yeah. And it is classic median voter politics in an MMP age. And National probably looked at that policy and thought, oh, damn, we should have done something just like that. And it's a bit like National's 10,000 charger install subsidies, which are fantastic for those people who already have electric cars, including Christopher Luxon's good partner. And it...
do we call her his better half? I'll bet he calls her his better, which is an expression that if I hear anybody say that, it makes me more or less ill. What does he call her? No. Mrs. Luxon or my better half?
Possibly.
Mummy?
Yeah.
Jesus. What did you just say?
No.
Catherine, our lawyers are on. What did you just say? That was very good. I think I heard did you say mummy?
Yeah.
Mother, isn't that the way it goes, mother?
Mother. So that's one of those policies that is really designed for the middle class. So that's on the election campaign front. We've yet to see National's emissions policy for the farming sector, although it's announced last night that it would double the number of RSC workers coming in, and would also allow farms to set up dams without resource consents, which would fuel more of the increase in cows and sheep in the country.
That's interesting, because somebody I know has a dam that's been built without resource consent already, and is absolutely having a coronary about, because it's quite near the road. And within range of the council I know in that area does use drones to zip around.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
So this was something that has been talked about, and National have said we'll get rid of the red tape, and we'll allow these dams to be built. But Catherine, this week there's also been plenty of news on the actual climate front in terms of science, and also tracking the performance of all the countries who've signed up to the Paris Agreement in actually achieving their required reductions in emissions, and where we are on the quest to try to avoid cooking the planet.
Yes.
So do you want to tell us about the stock take?
Right. So the stock take, the UN stock take on how the world is going against the 2030 targets, which sounds like not particularly well. They're a bit light on the actual how far behind are we, but it sounds like we're not exactly on track. So that's a bit worrying. We certainly know that we're not on track in New Zealand. The question is how many other countries are in the same boat, and will we be able to hide our not on track in amongst all the other not on tracks, to the detriment of everybody, obviously.
Yeah, one of the things I tried to do this week was nail down Nicola Willis on whether National were actually going to commit to the 2030 targets, which are to reduce emissions, gross emissions by 50%, particularly from transport and housing. And unfortunately, she wouldn't. There was a lot of wriggling that went on. They're happy with the 2050.
Steady on.
Yeah, no. So there was no there was no commitment to the 2050 target from National. 2030, there was lots of talk about we'll try to achieve it and that sort of thing. And
But what are they
when I
committed to,
pushed,
Bernard? Because we're committed to something, aren't we? Nationally.
Well,
well,
that's interesting as well because we've got the Zero Carbon Act, which says New Zealand is committed to, net zero by 2050. But under the Paris Agreement, that's not what we're actually committed to. Under the Paris Agreement, we're only committed to 50% cuts by 2050. So, I mean, I'm not even sure which one of those they're
well, in theory, but National has previously agreed to abide by the Paris Agreement, and in fact, was certainly involved in the lead up to the Paris Agreement. And there's been no suggestion until now from National that they would bail out of it. Now, ACT have been much more robust about not only saying, we should repeal the Zero Carbon Act, but this business of, paying for credits overseas and things is crazy. And some of the language coming out of some of the ACT candidates is very,
Fruity.
denier adjacent, let's say, and even comments this week from National's energy spokesperson retweeting and talking about essentially saying we need fossil fuels and that sort of thing. Is there's a risk here that National step on a landmine here and find themselves being accused of being climate denying head in the sand types. Catherine, the other thing that's come out this week I think is worth mentioning for our audience is some comments out of a new paper that talks about planetary boundaries. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so for those who aren't familiar with the planetary boundaries model, you've probably heard about planetary boundaries, but if you want to go and look at the actual model, and there's a great graphic that goes with it, you can find it at stockholmresilience.org. And they've basically outlined nine planetary boundaries and a safe operating space for humanity, and these are split into 9 different domains. And the latest iteration of that research, so originally we didn't have measurements for all of those domains. We knew they were important, but we didn't even have the ability to measure them to see how we were going within those domains, but now we do. And at the moment what we have is that 6 of those 9 planetary boundaries we are already operating well beyond the safe operating space for humans. And 3 that aren't, one of the 3 is ocean acidification, and what's a bit scary about this model is how close we are to crossing that boundary as well, and some of the implications of ocean acidification are, they're pretty scary actually.
So
They're quite grim.
what would happen with crossing that acidification boundary?
I mean, I think the thing with all of these planetary boundaries that you have to bear in mind is they're all connected to each other as well. So once you cross the first 6, the last couple get a bit easier to cross. And with the ocean acidification, it's tied up with...
Bernard.
No more power. No.
Yeah,
That's right.
I mean, it stuffs.
Yeah.
It stuffs. I was going to say cetaceans. It probably will stuff them too, but crustaceans.
Yeah, I mean, you've got so much of the global population being fed from fishing stocks, so you lose that. That's a food issue. There's all the ocean currents that you start to lose, so the meridional overturning thing. So that's the AMOC, and there's also one associated with the Antarctic, which could change the weather all over the world.
But that's not to do with acidification, though, is it? Or does acidification feed into that?
Well, it's to do with. Yeah, I mean, it all sort of connects up, yes, because ocean acidification comes about from the ocean stratifying into different levels, and it's those current overturns that actually mix the water up a bit to prevent that from happening. So the two kind of go hand in hand. So one of the first things you do is you start to lose those currents, and it has effects on things like El Nino and La Nina, and all of these things are sort of all connected up.
I was going to ask you about El Nino,
really could
Catherine.
lead to some abrupt weather changes.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, Catherine, about El Nino, because I read something this week. It's anticipated to be one of the warmer ones of the series, particularly for places like New Zealand. We've already got warming seas, which has led to, what would appear to some very big changes in our weather, particularly around what we expected, more wet periods, more cyclonic activity. What's the outlook that you've been seeing about El Nino for us? Not to be parochial and bring it back to New Zealand.
Yeah. I mean, the latest I heard, it wasn't going to be probably as big as, say, the 1998, 2016 ones, but it's still hard to tell how. And the problem is that because it's sitting on top of a warming climate, every time you have another one of these cycles, it's worse than the last one, just simply because it's sitting on top of a warmer climate when it happens. So, yeah, and the effects for New Zealand are quite different to the rest of the world when it comes to La Nina. So where La Nina tends to imply hotter, wetter weather, we often get, we get a mix of things, but we get a lot of drier, cooler weather.
Cast-offs from Australia, in other words.
Yeah. So it's kind of a mix of things, and it depends on where you are in New Zealand as to what you can actually expect.
And Catherine, we've seen this incident in Libya this week. I've been reading a lot about it. I'm sure you have. I noticed there's a phrase for Storm Daniel, which that Libya has copped the kind of loop that Storm Daniel has done through the Mediterranean, which is now apparently known to forecasters as a Medicane, which is a Mediterranean hurricane, and it did dump a tremendous amount of water. But then what do we know yet? What the level of attribution in that disaster is to climate change? As opposed
I don't know if they've actually done the attribution work yet, but again, that any kind of storm action that you get sits on top of a warmer climate, so it tends to amplify everything. But that's a really good example of negative feedbacks happening, right? Because you've got poor infrastructure there because of civil unrest and and all of those sort of things, and then you get a storm which comes along and bursts those dams and has such tragic consequences. But you can also imagine that recovery from that is going to be so difficult that the infrastructure is going to continue to be even weaker and even more at risk from the next. So you get these negative feedback loops that just make the situation more and more dire for the people
I just noticed that Time has interviewed some people and says that it is highly likely that Storm Daniel was aggravated by climate change, but that they won't understandably attribute it to it. But as you say, it's also a very good reminder that it's often the most difficult, complex, dare I say, shittiest places that are worst affected by this. I mean, the idea of something going off in Libya, where it has no unified government, it's implausibly corrupt, and is an incredibly sort of inevitable and sad outcome.
The warning sign I'd say for that is that bad infrastructure and underinvestment in infrastructure is kind of a condition in a lot of countries, including New Zealand at the moment. And so you kind of think down the line, this is something we want to be thinking about, is that if we have such poor infrastructure that we haven't invested in, and then we get hit by more and more stronger climate effects, which in themselves take so much money to recover from, that you start to get into this kind of position where it gets harder and harder to do the infrastructure work that you need to do ahead of the next disaster.
Gosh, what a brilliant chart you've just put up there, Bernard.
Yes, I just wanted to put this up. Unfortunately, the people on YouTube can't see it. I'll include in the version of the Hoon that goes out tomorrow morning. But what we've got there is a chart which shows the various forcing factors behind global temperature change in the last 10 years, which essentially strips out the effects of a man-made global warming, El Nino and La Nina, the Tonga eruption, and also the effects of marine fuel pollution. And so you can start to see that it is about global warming, and it is about fossil fuel burning and the effects of methane and other climate emissions from farming.
Bernard, what's the source for that? I mean, you've said the Kaka, but I don't believe the Kaka is the original source there. I'd like to see the attribution.
I'm outraged at that.
I also want to make sure that your X and Y axis is correct. If there's some total bollocks,
What do you mean? We're doing some great research.
No, this is actually from a thing called Berkeley Earth, which is an independent climate data organisation, which provides
from the evil socialists at
like
Berkeley University.
Berkeley, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's another one here from Berkeley, which shows you the August, where we are in August, and the temperature for the world over that period from 1850, and you can see how far above the normal
Well, I
it
mean,
is.
the
this
poor
so
people
far
on
this year.
YouTube can't in fact see that, Bernard. So you better describe it.
Yeah.
You know, it's
So what
it's
you're
a bell
seeing
curve,
is,
but with this, there's a new ringing on the bell at the top.
yes, and what you can see there is the rise in temperature and the final point estimated now for 2023, which is for a clear rise from over 1.5 degrees above
Yeah.
industrial.
Speaking of
In that
climate
there,
change,
'cause,
there's Robert.
it's wonderful to go down to
But
a
Bernard,
slightly
let
cooler.
me just we've sort of about there's a couple. I mean, I joked a little bit before about propane and heat pumps. I had never encountered a heat pump really until I came back to New Zealand a couple of years ago, and I have one. I take a great deal of pride in living, you know, putting on an extra sweater and everything, and then going online as you do. I know because you have the vendor who has the hour of power. So I know everything in your house is washed. You know, Mrs. Hickey zooms around with the Dyson at 9 times mighty speed and the hour of power, and I do similar
Hickey
things.
will come and defenestrate you with the
Yes,
phrase, Mrs. Hickey.
Defenestration would be a
no.
pleasure from but
Yeah, no.
but I have noticed, so because the UK is in this tremendous, as is Europe, this tremendous dilemma with heat pumps, that there are just far too many of them. The scale of replacing everybody's boilers and everything is gigantic. They don't generate enough heat. But there's a moderately optimistic piece in The Economist, I think this week, possibly last week's issue actually, about using tiny amounts, like a 500 grams of propane inside them rather than hydrofluorocarbons,
HFCs, yep.
yeah, and because they're being ruled out as well. And so there is some optimism, but there's a tremendous way to go before you are going to be able to have realistic replacement of the entire. You remember what it was like living in the UK with boilers and Christ knows what. It's going to be very
I
difficult.
liked the radiators. I thought they were good.
Yes, of course you did. I bet you. I bet if we went to wherever you
Grew up
were,
with them.
your socks would be on there and your undies.
Wow. This,
Be like-
Oh, it
I
was
remember-
so warm, and also
It'd be
you
like
didn't have
living
all
in
this
Bernard's
rushing air.
bedroom. Eh?
And
Yeah,
the
exactly.
whole house was warm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember as,
slightly too warm, and then also you'd probably have sash windows, so there'd be a bloody draft as well.
yeah.
No sash windows.
Anyway, let's move on. Catherine, thank you so much for coming in and
Thank you.
talking
you.
about the climate and other things. And Robert, it's wonderful to see you. We wanted
Thank
to
you.
spend a bit of time, as Peter mentioned at the beginning of the show, on Ukraine. So I'm going to hand it over to the
armchair generals.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could go and get some item of camouflage from my yeah. So Robert, I thought it was I said to you in a note today, we sometimes I mean, like this lovely chap David Coombs who I hang out with more or less on Jervois Road. It said, could we address the current state of the battlefront? And I've prepared for this by reading the IWS. I just found that thing I shared with you from the Royal
Very good
United
source.
Services Institute. Very good source. And there's a kind of a complicated picture about the front. And then I see also Mike Mully, the U.S. Not Defense Secretary. He's the head of Joint Chiefs of Staff, is saying that Ukrainians have probably only got 30 to 40 days to really push through because of weather. How are you?
Yeah, and the
how
Ukrainians
are you seeing it
reject
now?
that,
While
of
I
course.
grab my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we've discussed before that applies in this context, Peter, is because an operation like this has never been attempted before, and our good friend at St Andrews keeps pointing this out, there's a lot of false analysis about expectations. That is to say, because it's never been done before, that is a counteroffensive launched against 3 layers of fortification established over 6 months without air cover, because that's the challenge they face.
Yeah.
Then some benchmarks for success were that they should sort of break through within about 2 to 3 months, I think. Whereas they are, they're making some pretty. They've demonstrated, particularly in the last week, they're making some sophisticated, deep, well orchestrated deep strikes, hundreds of kilometers behind the front line. We saw in Sevastopol devastating strikes against the Minsk, a large landing craft, and also a submarine.
Called the Rostov on
both
Don.
sunk. Yeah, I mean,
when you say they're sunk, they were in a dry dock, right? So they've been both.
they're largely destroyed.
They've been very severely damaged, it would appear.
Very severely damaged, and it couldn't come at a worse time because it's got big black implications for the Black Sea Fleet. And then, of course, you had this devastating strike in a part of Crimea where there was two, as I understand it, air defence systems. When they seem to have been largely destroyed, and they were valued about 1.2 billion US dollars. So, and that affects Russia's ability with the knocking out of those sophisticated air defense systems. Their grip on Crimea is eroding, and so we're seeing this cumulative but punishing targeting of Russian key capabilities.
Yes.
And
it's also, Robert. It's also there's. Are we? Because I think I shared with you a piece because there's a very interesting chap who not many of us know much about, and I certainly don't. Which is this guy Sir Tony Radakin, who is the most senior British military officer.
Yeah.
And he's been very close to the Ukrainians, and he's talking about quite serious penetration of the Russian lines. As we know, they want to go kind of south. The Ukrainians want to go kind of southeast and cut off the Ukraine, but they don't have to go too far. They don't have they have to be able to just jeopardize that line. And also, I imagine, Robert, and this is where you're so good at this about the sort of politics of this or the diplomacy, doing these they're spectaculars. Doing this penetration of drones to Moscow, blowing up those ships, is a very good it's quite an exciting PR win. And I don't mean that just in a sort of crass way.
No,
because they've got to keep the West thinking that they're competent.
I think it achieves both. It shows they can hit really important capabilities, but they're also, if you like, pulling the narrative away that they're losing the counteroffensive. And I do think some of the expectations around the counteroffensive were unrealistic. But I do think Ukraine shows no sign of letting up. And the other thing here to take, we don't have to necessarily rely on media commentators or scholars some of whom actually feel quite threatened by the prospect of Ukrainian success. I think we know who they are. The guys who've always argued land for peace. Well, if Ukraine win, some of them are, they'll have to see whether they've had it wrong all their careers.
Yeah, no, but you sent me a very good piece on the New State. Well, an okay piece. I do think we have to reflect that view because it's not an irrelevant view, and I get slightly nervous with the. I mean, I'm not accusing you of being a boosterism person, but this is there is an art to what Putin is doing. It seems to me, which is forcing everybody to wait and to break Western patience and to break Western endurance.
Yeah,
but these spectaculars really help that. It seems to me.
But I think the respect for Putin's strategy has slowly waned. As this conflict unfolds, we're seeing a whole series of red lines set out by Putin crossed, and it won't be long before Ukrainians have F-16s. Probably October. We can't be precise on that. It also looks as if the Americans are finally lifting the lid on that long-range missile system.
Yeah,
I never remember the acronym. So
ATACMS.
ASTM. Yeah,
ATACMS. ATACMS.
Yes, that's the one. And these are formidable capabilities that they've long needed. And the other thing is that Mr. Putin is showing extreme signs of concern. Inviting Kim Jong-un
by having a meeting with Kim Jong-un at a cosmodrome.
Yeah, The other thing is, you see, what is really dangerous, and this is why Zelensky is going for these high-profile targets. To be fair, we're hearing about the spectacular ones, but they are relentlessly going after less profile or less high-profile capabilities, and they're doing it all the time. And there seems to be a systematic, I know we've mentioned this before, but it's worth emphasizing, systematic destruction of capabilities like conscription offices and chemical plants, warehouses, petroleum depots. All these things are getting attacked on a relentless scale every night. I mean, I'm not quite sure who's doing it, but it's happening. And the other thing is that
sorry.
I was just final point.
Yeah.
If you're trying to get an accurate gauge on how it's going, another thing to look at is the Russian media, where there seems to be a state of demoralization now amongst Mr. Putin's pundits. His people have always been boosters for him. They seem to be flagging, and so again, I think the stakes are considerable, and we'll probably have some twists and turns ahead. But I think those who said the counteroffensive have failed could yet be confounded.
Robert, may I ask you a sort of a NATO-ish question here? We had, I think, 10 days ago, a week ago, certainly the debris, probably the actual wreckage of a Russian drone landing in Romania on the other side of the Danube from the Ukrainian grain ports. And overnight, we've had a remarkable piece from the BBC about an attack that I think we probably discussed, I think, back in October, which is where two Sukhoi Russian fighter jets approached a British Airwax aircraft that had come through. I just looked at its track today. It came through Varna, more or less, which of course is where Dracula left to come to Whitby. But that's a tiny, weeny digression. But it flew across and was then. But it turns out that the missile that supposedly did drop, but that an earlier one was actually fired at the Airwax plane. Christ knows how it actually got out of the way. But so that would have been a very alarming incident. And I mean, we've got that.
The British seem to have played it down, Peter. That's the interesting. Well, I suppose it's not. I think for several reasons they'll play it down. Certainly, they don't want NATO having to cite Article 5 and getting NATO dragged in, because that could undermine support for Ukraine. But the second thing is, of course, I think the British were probably reluctant to make a big deal about it because they probably didn't want to advertise just how much information they were getting.
Yes,
about.
I wondered about that too. Yeah.
Apparently, they were in international airspace when they did this over the Black Sea.
Yeah,
and they were even able to translate the pilots' conversations simultaneously. There must be some fantastic technology on board.
ChatGPT. Yeah,
but apparently the two pilots had a huge row in the course of the attempted assault on the.
Can you imagine that?
Yeah, the first one told him.
Can you imagine that while doing Mach 1 and having a row with the other?
Yes, yeah, well, I think pilot number 1 warned number 2 not to fire a missile. He fired a missile, and then he questioned his sanity, and then he fired another missile, which led to expletive-deleted exchanges, which the British may have enjoyed once they calmed down. But it was quite a near thing.
You mean once they changed into a new uniform, I suspect.
Yeah, well, I mean, there were 30 people aboard their AWACS.
Allegedly,
and it was just laden with equipment. But it's extraordinary, the capabilities they have. And I can see why the Russians would be nervous about those sort of capabilities hovering near the battle zone, because they pick up a lot of stuff there.
Well, I think just to mention that intelligence aspect, whether it's from that aircraft, or it was also remarkable that the New York Times had a fantastic scoop, I think Monday last week, as we discussed in the last pod, that the Kim Jong-un Putin meeting was going to happen. Very well described, and of course, right through this battle, this conflict, from several months ahead, we've had the most extraordinary sort of weird transparency of the extent of intelligence that is gained. What do you think's going on there? We've talked about it before, but
this is a tactic. It has been a departure from the past, as you mentioned, and I think it's a tactic to keep Putin off balance. I mean, the fact of the matter is, authoritarian states like to present liberal democracies with fait accompli. I'm sure Mr. Putin's dream scenario was that Kim would turn up unannounced in Vladivostok, or wherever he is at the moment, and he was at the space center, wasn't he, in the Far East?
Yeah, which I didn't realise was a cosmodrome I didn't realise that was a cosmodrome that Putin had built in order to reduce their dependence on the one in Kazakhstan, the traditional one that Baikonur we've all seen over the years. Let me just ask you a question, because Bernard's desperate to move on to China, but
of course.
Elon Musk. I wrote something in the spin-off this week. Ronan Farrow wrote a very good piece a couple of months ago, a couple of weeks ago in the New Yorker about the extent to which the US is dependent on Musk for so many things, and of course he just keeps stepping in to these various crises. I mean, he's got Netanyahu coming to visit him, and
Yes,
on
after he
the,
made
on the
allegations.
West Coast this week, about to try and help him with the anti-Semitism problem on Twitter.
Yeah.
Taiwan had a tantrum yesterday about his comments about China considering Taiwan part of its territory, and we've had this weird thing with him and Walter Isaacson, his new biographer, about did you turn it off or did you just never have it turned on, and did you agree to for the Starlink covering Crimea? It's a very interesting dependency on a single strategic man.
It is, and
assets.
in a sense, I think some people in the Democratic leadership may now be quite privately disappointed with Musk, because I think, the idea of an entrepreneur, Elon Musk has been a bit of a national hero. He's worked for Tesla, and he seemed to be, far-sighted. But in fact, he seems to have emerged as someone who has not conformed to the expectations that many people had of him. And
but Robert,
he's
how do you see this? So, one of the if you've read, I haven't read the book yet, but I have read the previous book by Ashley Vance about him. Isaacson reveals that Musk takes ketamine, that he's incredibly lonely, that he has spectacular mood swings, which I think we already knew. When you're thinking again about lecturing and helping people through their PhDs and everything, can you recall a sort of time when you've had a kind of great man of history or whatever sort of so strongly in the middle of all of something like this?
Well, do you mean personally, or do you mean observing other people going through this?
When you're thinking about it from an academic point of view, do you say, oh, it's just the same as JP Morgan, or it's just the same as the Rothschilds? What this must be quite a confronting thing for you when there's an unelected person who's deploying a phenomenal power or discretion.
It's not unusual in history. I mean, other unelected people have exerted tremendous power in the past. I mean, for a while, Joseph Kennedy, before he became U.S. ambassador, he became very eminent and was really favoured initially by the Roosevelt administration until he became ambassador to Britain. And then it began to go a bit sour quite rapidly. But
that's exactly the kind of
there are parallels over here with Musk in a different way. I mean, Joseph Kennedy, Kennedy, was a brilliant financier at his time. He got through the Wall Street crash, and then he had various jobs in the early 30s where he was very competent on the financial front. And he built up quite a big reputation, and that crumbled quite rapidly when he moved into he was very accomplished in the financial sphere, but when he got into the area that he really loved, finances ironically bored him. But when he got into the area that he was really interested in, I'm afraid it all went to custard, at least from the president's point of view.
But he then had two
particularly
sons
Mr. Kennedy's
who didn't do too badly.
infatuation with Hitler.
Yeah, but he didn't do too badly with his sons, right? So
No,
maybe
not at
Elon
all.
will
And
be
they
able to
also,
insert
I think,
one of his 63 children
as Jack
into this.
Kennedy used to like to say, everyone has their fathers. But anyway, which was a bit of a put down.
Do you
But
say everyone hates their fathers or has them?
no, everyone has their fathers in the sense of
Sorry, I've just
well,
revealed too
dad
much
will be dad.
psychologically, which
I mean, no, I don't
kill me
think.
for
I think
later.
he loved his dad. Every impression that he was very fond of his parents.
But Elon did not.
But
now Bernard's just sitting. Look at him. Look at him. He's like, he's
I'm
just-
very keen
Go ahead.
to drag this back
let's go to China.
China, because I wouldn't say I'm obsessed, but it is really important, not just in the relationship with New Zealand, but also, the dance that's going on involving Russia and North Korea and America, and the apparent turmoil inside the very senior leadership in China. We've learned today from the Financial Times that the defense minister, whose name is Li Shangfu, has not been seen in public. One of these classic, he's been missing in action, so to speak. And the US is saying that He may well have been stripped of his responsibilities and placed under investigation. What do you make of these sorts of things, which seem to crop up every now and again out of
He
China?
seems to be following the fate of the former foreign minister, doesn't he? Where he may have been implementing the boss's instructions just a little bit too accurately, and with things not working so well on the domestic and international front, maybe Ms. Xi Jinping. I'm wondering if Xi Jinping is feeling a bit of heat, and he needs to have a reshuffle to take the pressure off himself. That is to say, all these people have been put in place, presumably with his approval, and things are not going well, as you've alluded to, Bernard, on the economic front. And they're not going particularly well on the strategic front either, actually, because Mr. Xi put quite a lot of faith in at least being supportive of Mr. Putin's invasion in a sort of semi-detached way. And he may be getting... The other thing is, this is the thing about reading the tea leaves in an authoritarian state. We don't know how much pressure and criticism he's getting behind closed doors. And he may
must be
feel
quite
very
alarmed,
much on
Robert,
the
by
defensive. Sorry?
That Kim Jong-un meeting must be quite alarming in a kind of weird way to Xi.
Well, I don't think it is, because I think she knows that Russia's got a basket economy. And it shouldn't have, of course, because it's a country of wonderful resources. But at the moment, the Russian economy is hugely underperforming. And, of course, it's not helped by the demands of war. 500 million a day or whatever it is. It's costing the Russian economy. And so since North Korea is about 95% dependent on the Chinese, I don't think the Chinese see...
That's what I mean. That this seems... I mean, they've kept him vaguely sane and sort of in a large metal box with a piece of garlic on top, and here he takes his armored train with the pink chairs up to Vladivostok. That's got to be
that's not out of
concerning,
character,
isn't
is it? I mean, he's often frustrated the Chinese by some of these nuclear tests. When the Americans were working more cooperatively before the Trump era, they were. I'm not saying they always saw eye to eye. There was always a doubt in Washington that China was really trying to strain, but at least they were publicly upbraiding and regretting these nuclear tests. And he didn't hesitate to do them. He didn't seem intimidated. The fact that 3/4 of North Koreans don't have any electricity and there are genuine food problems,
They'd only waste it.
It doesn't seem to worry the
Peter.
dictator.
But
No, that's right. And
Robert,
and-
I guess I'm thinking about Stalin and Mao. I often think about Stalin. He's one of my favorite people in a sense. But being like you, an incredible student of history, that doesn't end well when you've had Russia and China and yes, Soviet Union and CCP, Mao and Stalin kind of working together and then clashing over North Korea. It's a bad scene.
I don't know. I feel that the Chinese don't really regard Putin's Russia as a true partner. I think there's been a lot of theatrics involved. They do have a common interest in trying to counter US power, but as we discussed previously, they've been bringing these maps out in which they're reclaiming part of Russia and India, and it seems to me that China's ambitions are not wedded to the situation in Russia, and it's interesting that China has really taken advantage of Russia's isolation following its invasion of Ukraine. I mean, I always have the sense of the Chinese that they were quite frustrated with Kim Jong-un, but thought any alternative would be worse, particularly a Western-supported alternative.
And there is an element of opportunism here in that North Korea sending weapons to Russia is going to provide the weapons to Russia and not put China under pressure to provide the weapons to Russia. So there's an element of that saves us from having to send the shells over. Peter, Robert, thank you very much for coming on to the show again. It's wonderful to have you.
Thanks, Robert.
Oh well, I think we've finished with the Russia-China stuff. Thank you, Robert. I wanted to welcome onto the show for the first time Rebecca Stevenson from interest.co.nz. No, we're very, very lucky to have Rebecca on. Rebecca, you've written a bunch of stories in recent weeks about the real problem with scams and frauds being perpetrated on the customers of New Zealand's banks, particularly the Big Four. Could you tell us about what you've reported earlier in the week, particularly around the issue of hush payments?
Yeah, that's right. So I became aware that there were some banks making settlements to New Zealanders who had made what are called authorized payments to scammers. So that's where you haven't been hacked, where you've actually sort of like the Waka Kotahi scam, you get sent a link and you click on it and you give their details, and next thing you know, your accounts are drained. So up until this point, we didn't realize that the banks were actually paying back any of these customers any money at all. As it stands, the New Zealand Banking Code of Practice says that banks will pay back customers who inadvertently or unwittingly fall foul of these scammers. But we do know now that the banks are actually paying back some people who are falling victim to authorized payment scams. But what they've been doing is offering partial settlements, often half or so. But in the other hand, they are also asking people to sign non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality clauses, meaning that they can't discuss that they've had any money back. Now, there's an obvious reason that the banks would do that. They don't want to admit liability for these authorized payment scams.
Or they don't want everybody jumping in.
Exactly. They don't want everybody to want to settle too. So it definitely suits them to try and keep that under wraps. It's obviously great for those who have actually got some of their money back. But on the other hand, you know, you do have a situation where some people might not know and be disadvantaged. And it obviously has suited the banks, I think, you know, to make these partial payments because they've been firm about no liability.
Yeah, I was curious to see how far behind our banks are, best practice on dealing with the scammers and the fraudsters. Overseas, there's been much more aggressive use of checking of names and of accounts and of cleaning up the scammers, who often end up with actual bank accounts, you know, in the same sorts of banks. What's been the response of the banks so far in all of this, which on the face of it looks tardy?
Yeah, they really have been dragging their heels. You know, when we look at those countries that we like to compare ourselves with, particularly Australia, and with these kinds of frauds, the United Kingdom, we do seem quite far behind. You know, the United Kingdom introduced name and account number checking or confirmation of payee in 2020. Now, obviously, today, the New Zealand Banking Association has said it will instigate that and make it happen here in New Zealand. They've been throwing up lots of reasons as to why it can't happen here, and also been making quite a few excuses too, saying that actually it hasn't stopped scams in the UK. Well, it's not going to stop scams. They always keep iterating and changing what they're doing. But what critics have been saying is that because New Zealand hasn't plugged this hole, our system has been seen as a soft touch and an easy target for scammers. And that's why we've been seeing these really big haul scams, hundreds of thousands of dollars taken from New Zealanders as a result.
And Rebecca, may I ask, we've got,
Sorry?
you know, a large number of the New Zealand, or a large portion of the New Zealand banking system is run by Australian banks. What's the regime in Australia? I know what in the UK you get 100% back. It's required, and it really does put. I bank in the UK still too, and the sometimes I find it irritating, but the second factor, multi-factor authentication and so on that you have to do in the UK is quite a good protection when you're transferring money. Just what's the liability for the banks in Australia?
They still haven't brought in industry-wide name and account number checking. There are some moves that have been made. National Australia Bank has introduced some of its own account checking systems, but they haven't had an industry-wide system. What the New Zealand Banking Association has said today is that it will do an industry-wide push. Now, of course, New Zealand's payment system is run by Payments NZ, which is owned by the banks. So they are well placed to bring it in here in New Zealand. I think it will obviously cost money, and there will be technical changes.
And Rebecca, do Australian banks in Australia have to pay back people who get scammed?
There's no mandatory.
So it's the same sort of situation as here.
Yeah, that's
Thank you.
right. The UK has really gone one step further. As of next year, they will have to pay back everybody. And it basically is saying, that will force you to make your systems as secure as possible because you're going to be financially on the hook for
Yeah.
anyone who gets
May I
scammed.
ask you one? Because I think there's a lot of people talking about this on our chat on YouTube, and it's extremely easy. I got something the other day, and I don't know why this is going to be touch wood, but very often things purport to be from a legitimate source. The Waka Kotahi one looked extremely legitimate, I'm told. Often you have to go dig back through the URLs of the emails that they're sending them from to realize it's a sort of bogus thing about Amazon or thing about Apple or something. But sometimes, like I had one the other day purporting to be from Apple, and it incorporated a message to an Apple no reply address as well, which doubled that sensor that it might actually be from Apple. It was a very weird. I mean, these people are very clever. I mean,
They're
what do you
very good
recommend?
at it.
What
This
do
is
you
their day
recommend to
job.
the many listeners of Bernard and my podcast, or Bernard's podcast, really, that I hitch a ride
Don't
on?
click on any links that anyone sends you via text or even via email. I would ring your bank directly, ring the source themselves and check. Don't ever rely on a number that's sent to you even. Even if your bank says to you, hey, ring this number, this number, I think you look up the number individually yourself, check it, verify it, and then ring. Don't take anything that gets sent to you as at face value.
Yeah, and
And
because
because
it's overtaken, Rebecca. Sorry, you're so good at this at interest, though. Just forgive me, Bernard. I will shut up in a second. But well, you'll be lucky. But we've got phishing has been a phenomenon, but we've also seen various weird investment scams. Which the Herald is particularly good on picking up of somebody who said, "I've just lost my last $200,000 in this," and you just think, "Oh my God, how did that happen?"
Yeah.
Do you want to comment on that as well, on the alternative methods?
Yeah. Those scams are really well done. That Citibank scam in particular was incredibly well done. The man that rings you has a nice soft British accent. He's incredibly well spoken. He's very plausible. They
We know
know a
how that
lot
works.
about you. They've researched you. They have already know that you're interested in investing. They have mocked up websites. They have mocked up an individual investment account that has your details on it. It looks like it's an investment portal that has your money in it. This is their proper day job, and they're incredibly good at it. With that Citibank term deposit scam, this is where the critics are saying that name and account number checking in particular could have made a difference, because that money actually went to accounts in New Zealand, actually
Oh,
ASB
that's
real
interesting.
accounts. So if
Blimey.
people had been able to see that it was actually paying to an ASB account and not a US Citibank account for a term
It looks
deposit,
even more, yeah.
it hopefully would have perhaps raised some flags.
Thank you.
And the scale of what's going on here is pretty stunning. There's been a poll come out last week from Horizon Research, a poll of 1,000 adults, which showed that 13% said that someone had used their card for fraud. So there's the sort of garden variety. Someone got hold of your credit card number and started using it. 10% had found that they'd experienced fraud through a bank account, and 7% said they were victims of cybercrime. So the numbers here are really starting to get up. 500,000 Kiwis fraud has been committed on them via a bank, and the numbers seem to be, heading into the hundreds of millions of dollars.
It's absolutely extraordinary. The banking ombudsman told Parliament last year that she estimated losses were about $200 million, but that is very conservative. I would say it's way in excess of that.
So if we have a supermarkets ombudsman and we have a banking ombudsman, what's happening? What's being done to fix this?
Kind of criticism is that the banking ombudsman scheme is beholden to the banks, that they run the banking ombudsman scheme through the code of practice. They're the ones that decide that they are only reimbursing, for example, those hacked payments rather than the authorized payments. Part of the Banking Association announcement with today is that they say they're going to do something to the banking ombudsman scheme.
Well, if they own that payment network, aren't we in a really good position to actually do it very, very well in New Zealand, potentially?
I think
Small
so. And I
market.
think now we really need to keep the pressure on that they do introduce this in a timely fashion. That's what Consumer NZ's John Duffy has said. He's worried about them dragging the chain now. He says, they have owned Payment NZ. There's no reason that if they say they want it, they need to make steps and actually bring it in now quickly, because they've dragged their heels for far too long.
And you do wonder, there's been criticism from the Reserve Bank to the banks about their lack of investment over the years in their tech systems. And you have to wonder if just the sheer scale of the cost of having to reinvest in making their systems cleaner is an issue here. Rebecca, wonderful to see you. Thank you very much for
Rebecca,
coming
I can
onto
just
the show.
we do a skateboarding dog, but let me just tell you a little story about my only currently, touch wood again, experience of being scammed or attempted scammed. Was in Marylebone High Street in London, where there was this spate of of what were often Romanian scammers, who would insert a little strip of magnetic plastic into an ATM with a little transmitter on it, and stand nearby. And when you put your card in, the little
Yikes!
it had to be, and the guy and I pulled out one of these things, which was about a sort of like pulling out from an anaconda or a hydatix worm, if you remember what those were, out of the ATM. And the guy, and then I started yelling in Romanian at the guy and chasing him up the street. So at least I had the satisfaction of seeing who was trying to scam me and holding this enormous piece of presumably moderately expensive plastic that he was using to transmit, my credit card details to his app. But anyway. I don't want to be like Todd, what's his name, from NBR and do a citizen's arrest on somebody, but I would have.
I think they've kind of moved on from that. Now it is very systemic. It's very processed. It's really savvy scamming, and with these investment scams. So it's not that kind of piece of plastic on the machine that we need to worry about now. It's that text. It's that investment offer.
And much of it is state sponsored. I mean, this is one of the big concerns here, is that a lot of this is coming from North Korea, and it's coming from Russia, and it's coming from China, using the scale that you can create to weaponize these scams. So you can do it at enormous scale, and all you need is 0.5% to respond, and you're in. And the cost of it's much lower. Yeah. Rebecca, thank you so much. Wonderful to have you on, and we'd love to have you on again at some point. That's great. And say hello to all my friends and former colleagues at Interest.
If you like digression, you're in the right place.
Doing. Yeah. Yeah. Now, skateboarding dog, Peter.
Well, there's a couple of things. So the ignoble awards came out today, and the one I particularly like and the ignoble awards are those ones that come out every year just ahead of the actual Nobel Prize, and they're for sort of weird science. And one of the best ones today is a study of why scientists lick rocks. Because apparently there's a historic precedent for scientists licking rocks, and like a good wine, you can tell its minerality, and it's, you can say, oh, it's a Chateau Moussigny 54, or it's, and it's a nice peaty little rock, or it's got gold in it. But apparently the main reason they lick rocks now is because it creates a little sheen on them, which makes the properties of it more evident. But the great thing is somebody's done a study about that. So that's my
good. Science is a wonderful thing, isn't it? That's great. And no doubt the rocks, there might be some salt in there, I'm sure, at times.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Well, let's try it tonight. I think if we start licking the pavement in Jervois Road, we might, there's too many doggies.
Too many little dogs. Too many little dogs. Yeah. Wonderful to see you again, Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone. Shortly, in fact.
Yes, thank you very much for everyone for joining us on the Hoon.
And I'm sorry if I wasted anybody's time, Wendy.
We will see you all next week. Have a great weekend, everyone.
If you're lucky.
Cheers.
Bye. Thank you.